Hi, awesome disease and public health students. Going to use these slides as an overview of your non-specific immune defenses. Hopefully you're feeling good about the lymphatic system, which we just read about. Again, remember that it's basically sort of an alternative circulatory system that runs all throughout your body, as you can see in this diagram here. But there's no heart associated with it. It's all liquid is moved by basically your muscle movements. But again, this is liquid that has leaked out of your blood through the capillaries. It's plasma in your blood, then becomes interstitial fluid, and then becomes lymphatic fluid as it flows back into your circulatory system at the two drainage points there and there. And as that happens, your lymphatic system is full of lymphocytes, or basically white blood cells that are constantly checking for and destroying pathogens that might be in your blood. Pretty amazing system. However, there are some parasites that can get into your lymphatic system and block it up. This is what causes elephantiasis. And so again, it's a parasitic worm that blocks lymphatic vessels, and it causes massive swelling because all that fluid that leaked out of your blood is unable to return to your blood. And so this is usually a common feature of it. You can find all kinds of crazy pictures on Google if you care to look them up. And I don't know if they treat this by draining the lymph. I think it's a little complicated to do that because it's so evenly distributed everywhere. You can't just kind of poke a hole and have it all drain out. So this is a pretty bad condition to get. Okay, let's move on now from the lymphatic system and talk specifically about your immune defenses. And I want to focus today specifically just on the non-specific defenses. There's two lines that I'll talk about. The first line, obviously, is your skin. It's a physical barrier that blocks things. You have a bunch of layer of compactly layered cells that are very hard to get through. There's also hairs and pores that secrete different liquids that help kind of clear and prevent any pathogens from getting in. Your openings are also all guarded. So saliva in the mouth, mucus in your nose, tears in your eyes, all have lysosomes, basically, which are enzymes that can attack and kill bacteria and other pathogens. There's mucus lining your airways as well, so and as well as little cilia, and those basically trap any pathogens that might have already entered or gotten past your nasal cavity and down into your throat, and they can actually literally catch them and push them back up. Smokers tend to really destroy all their cilia, and so people who smoke are much more prone to lung and throat infections because they have, by smoking, have destroyed this sort of mucus and cilia layer. And your stomach obviously has digestive enzymes, so anything you eat that gets past any of the, especially the malt defenses that you might have, like in your tonsils and stuff, can be destroyed by the enzymes in your stomach. There are some pathogens, though, that manage to get past all that. Okay, here's a little more detail from your textbook with skin. It's pretty amazing to see, again, all these really compactly layered cells. And don't worry too much about the terminology, but, desmosomes and these basically keratin are these different proteins that really make it a really thick layer of cells that's hard to get through. And again, hairs, and you've got little glands as well, sweat glands that secrete a number of different liquids that can also help kind of clean and prevent things from getting through the skin and into your blood system. Okay, that's basically your first line of defense. Now let's focus on the second line of defense, which is basically what happens when pathogens manage to get past your skin or get past those initial chemical barriers. So to understand what's going on with this, you have to understand phagocytosis, which is done by phagocytes. Most common types of phagocytes are neutrophils, which are cells that can basically get into your interstitial fluid to attack any pathogens. Macrophages, we mentioned earlier too, technically not white blood cells, but they go around basically looking for anything foreign that doesn't really belong in your body, and they can ingest and digest it. And so this is a little diagram from your book showing that. So here's either a neutrophil or macrophage grabbing some kind of foreign bacteria that might be invading that it isn't showing the correct surface proteins to indicate that it belongs in your body. And so basically the reason it's called phagocytosis, we consider it sort of eating, is because it literally envelops, this defensive cell envelops that invader. It then has a separate vesicle full of lysosomes, which are basically it's a sack full of digestive chemicals. Those two fuse, those digestive chemicals completely break down and break apart that invading bacterium or pathogen, and then any debris are released. Now, as we learned earlier, sometimes this could contain what's called lipid A, which a lot of bacteria have in their cell walls, and that actually is technically toxic, and so it can have a bad effect on the body. But so that's sort of a fault that this system can have sometimes. Natural killer cells are technically not phagocytes because they're not really consuming pathogens. So we call them NK cells for short. They destroy any abnormal body cells, so anything that might be cancerous or cells that are infected, or just invading foreign cells like bacterial cells. And the way they do this is they attach to the surface of the invader. Again, don't worry too much about the details of this, but basically here are these little surface proteins that all match up. The NK cell right here attaches to a foreign invader, like a bacterial cell or something like that. That's the target cell, or a cancerous cell. And what's cool is they basically embed these proteins that are called perforins right here. And they essentially build a hole. It's like punching a hole into the membrane of that target cell. And here they're showing a bunch of lytic chemicals entering, but just by making a hole in the side of a cell, you're going to have fluids rush in just because of osmotic pressure. And that usually causes the target cell to burst, and they refer to this as lyse, right, or lysing. So natural killer cells destroy cells basically by lysing the target cells. You also have what's called the complement system, which is not something that is widely known. I only learned about this a few years ago when I took a graduate course in immunology. But our blood actually has 30 or more proteins that are just circulating around in your blood that have a very specific and specialized immune function. They take action in two different ways. You have what's called the classical pathway, which is when antibodies have been made by your immune cells, like your B cells, and the complement proteins sense that and also go into action. That's why they're called complement proteins, or complement system, because they complement or work with your immune response. So they'll respond to antibodies, or sometimes they don't need that either. They can still follow what's called the alternative pathway, where they just sense a foreign invader and can attack. And so this is one of these systems that, especially if you're suffering from something like HIV, where your antibody production might be compromised or low, your complement system can still kick into effect a little bit and give you some amount of immune response. But again, this doesn't work well on its own. It's a complement system. It usually works best by working with your other immune responses. There's three things that the complement system, this set of proteins, can do that you need to be familiar with. The first one is that they can just attach to the surface of a target cell like an invader. This is called opsonization, and it basically is just making this invader more attractive to macrophages. It's sort of like they're labeling this invader for destruction, right? They attach to the surface and they're sort of calling out to macrophages like, hey, come and eat this thing. They can also signal the inflammatory response by triggering mast cells, which contain a hormone called histamine. We'll talk about that in a second, but that begins what's called the inflammatory response. That's usually for a cut on the surface of the skin. And third, they can create their own little hole in the side of a cell, very similar to the perforins in natural killer cells make. These complement proteins can assemble into basically a ring that's called a membrane attack complex, or MAC. And again, it's very similar. It just makes a hole in the side of an invading cell, and that cell then bursts because fluid usually goes rushing in. So here's an image from your textbook that I think is helpful. Again, it's just showing you the different pathways. Don't worry about the numbers of the proteins and stuff like that, but it all converges with what's called C3. But anyway, here you go. You can see this is what's called opsonization. Opsonization, where they basically attach to the surface of a pathogen, and then a macrophage will phagocytize or consume it. Here's the other one where they get mast cells to release histamine and trigger what's called the inflammatory response, which I'll talk about in a second. And so that was the first pathway I talked about. Here's the second pathway, and then this is the third, where they can, again, punch a hole in the side of the invading cell. And I think this is really cool. But there's that ring referred to as a MAC, or membrane attack complex, where, again, they just basically build a hole of proteins, a ring of proteins inside the membrane, and fluids then rush in and cause that cell to burst. Here's another image of that, just showing you again the membrane attack complex, or MAC, and pretty cool. And again, when I took my graduate school course, we had to learn about how every single one of these proteins is assembled. But don't worry about that. It's just cool to see again that that's how that works. That's how they lyse a cell, is just punching a hole, numerous holes in the membrane. Okay, the inflammatory response is hugely important. Anytime pathogens reach the skin, so you get a splinter or a cut of any kind, inflammation occurs because you get the those common signs, right? Redness, very painful, swollen. It's really warm to the touch, and this all seems bad, but it's actually helping your immune system fight off an infection. So again, mast cells usually will detect the presence of some kind of foreign invader, and they release a hormone called histamine, and that dilates your blood vessels or widens them, and it causes an increase in blood flow to that particular area. Now again, this seems counterintuitive. Why would your body increase blood flow to a site where you've just been cut? But the reason for that is because blood contains phagocytes and white blood cells, which are going to come clean up the wounded area. It also contains platelets. Your blood has basically these little shards of protein that are going to help pack the opening and cause clotting so that the bleeding stops and healing can begin. So again, histamine causes the blood vessels to dilate or widen. This allows macrophages to exit the actual blood vessel and get into that interstitial space where they can then consume and destroy any pathogens that are trying to enter. Plasma then also leaks out, right? That interstitial fluid, that's why swelling occurs. And again, it warms up because there's a lot of cellular activity going on. And again, phagocytes are engulfing any pathogens, platelets clot and stop the bleeding, and then healing can begin once the wound has been cleaned out. Some bacteria can take root though, and sometimes inflammation doesn't work, or it gets so bad that basically it can become septic. So you want to, we use Band-Aids to cover up these injuries to make sure no other bacteria get in later on, or and sanitize it, right, using things like a Neosporin. I think this is just a repeat of that previous slide, just showing the second image here of the phagocytes eating the pathogen there. And here's just an alternative version of the same thing. But again, you've got your puncture, histamine gets released, blood vessel dilates, here come the phagocytes to consume any pathogens. There's all the swelling because fluid also fills in the space. And then as it begins to heal, the swelling will go down. The other two to mention are interferons, which are pretty cool. They're just a set of proteins that are inside of your cells. And I used to always think that they are basically defending an infected cell, but it turns out they're actually helping its other cells. So once a cell becomes infected, they use these proteins to sort of signal to other cells that, hey, a virus is going around. And the other cells can prepare themselves to, if a virus does try to enter and take over that cell to create more viruses, they have these proteins, interferons, activated that basically inhibit the synthesis of viral proteins. So it really gets in the way of the virus being able to replicate itself using host cells. There's a lot of research into this because these proteins essentially slow down the production of other proteins. And so this is something that could have been a possible cure for cancer, since cancer cells, again, are just in overdrive and constantly replicating and creating more and more protein. And so if we could get these interferons to try to interrupt that and slow down cell division, could be a possible cure for cancer or preventing tumors from forming. Again, no huge strides have been made there though. And fever is the last part of your chapter, and as you know, that's when your body temperature goes way up. It's usually controlled in your brain, and what happens is when you're suffering an infection, there's a certain chemical signal called pyrogens which gets sent to your brain, and basically it adjusts the thermostat, right? You have a constant body temperature. Most of you know it's 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 37 degrees Celsius. And that's where we always want to be maintained, but sometimes if you're suffering an infection, your body will raise that temperature, and that's because it's going to increase cellular activity. It might also denature the proteins of whatever invading pathogen you have. Not a pleasant experience to go through, but it does help your immune system to basically weaken and defeat an invading pathogen. Okay, hope that was helpful. Thanks.